There's something strangely hopeful about the first warm day of spring. Birds start screaming like they've just remembered their purpose in life. The neighbors roll out their grills like it's the 4th of July, and I, like any normal adult with a mild compost obsession, grab my gloves and decide to commit herbicide. Now, let me clarify something up front. I live in a cul-de-sac, in a house I own, on land I pay taxes for. And bordering this land, my land, thank you very much, is a narrow garden strip that runs up against a slightly leaning wooden fence. On the other side of that fence lives Karen, a woman whose hobbies include passive aggression, wearing expensive visors indoors, and reciting the HOA handbook like it's the Constitution. On this particular Saturday, emboldened by caffeine and a slightly delusional belief that I could grow tomatoes this year without accidentally creating a squirrel buffet, I went out to clear weeds and till soil. Somewhere between pulling up crabgrass and discovering an entire civilization of ants under an overturned stone, I stumbled upon a patch of aging daylilies. Let me tell you about these daylilies. They were technically mine, planted 5 years ago during a brief and misguided attempt at being a landscaping person. I remember thinking they would add a touch of class to the garden. In reality, they became overgrown, drooping stalks that looked like the botanical equivalent of giving up. So, I pulled them out. Every last one of them. Roots, bulbs, dead leaves, gone. I had big dreams now. Tomatoes, cucumbers, carrots. The holy trinity of people who think they'll eat healthier once they grow their own food and inevitably don't. Afterward, I went inside, feeling virtuous and smug, which is always a dangerous combination. I even posted a photo to my family group chat titled, Ground Zero for Future Salad. My aunt replied with a thumbs up emoji and a warning about squirrels. Then I heard it. A scream. Not a scream of pain or panic, but a shrill, theatrical wail. The kind you'd expect from someone discovering their favorite reality show had been canceled. I ran outside, thinking maybe someone had fallen or that a dog had escaped and was now terrorizing the mailman. But no, it was Karen, standing there in her pristine white capris and oversized sunglasses, arms flailing like she'd just seen someone deface a Monet. "You ripped up my lilies," she shrieked. At first, I genuinely thought she was kidding. I even laughed. Big mistake. They were my lilies, I said. On my side of the fence. I was clearing space for vegetables. Karen, in a voice that suggested she was auditioning for a soap opera, said, "They were planted before the fence was built. That makes them communal." Now, I'm not a botanist, but I do understand basic property lines. I pointed to the metal surveyor marker sticking out of the ground and said, as calmly as one can when speaking to someone holding an emotional grudge against root vegetables, "This is my garden. Those lilies were in my garden." Karen narrowed her eyes. "You've destroyed a shared aesthetic." I wanted to say that if the shared aesthetic included overgrown foliage and one sad gnome missing a hat, then yes, I was guilty. But instead, I said, "I'm planting tomatoes." She gasped, like I'd just suggested sacrificing goats under a full moon. Then, without another word, she stormed off toward her house, stomping through her gravel path like a suburban Godzilla. I half expected her to start throwing patio furniture. I figured that was the end of it, that maybe she'd cool off after a chamomile tea or 3. But I should have known better. Karen was the type who memorized the municipal code for fun. The type who color codes her garbage bins and then judges you for putting recyclables in the wrong one. As I turned to head back inside, I muttered something under my breath that rhymed with witch. It wasn't clever, but it was cathartic. That night, I looked out my kitchen window at the freshly tilled earth. It looked peaceful, honest, a place of new beginnings. I didn't know it yet, but this patch of soil, this innocent little stretch of land, was about to become the battleground for the weirdest war I'd ever fight. And it all started with a flower that didn't even smell good. By Sunday morning, my tomato dreams were still intact. The garden bed looked perfect. Well, perfect in a recently exorcised kind of way. I stood on my porch sipping coffee, admiring the neat brown rectangle of soil like it was a minimalist art piece. And for one brief moment, I thought, maybe this year will be different. Maybe I'll actually grow something other than regret. That thought lasted exactly 7 minutes. Because that's when Karen pulled into her driveway. Her car, a spotless white Lexus that somehow managed to look smug, rolled to a slow stop like it knew drama was coming. Karen stepped out, hair immaculately sprayed into place, holding a tote bag that probably cost more than my water heater. She glanced over at my garden, then froze. Her lips parted. Her nostrils flared. She tilted her head in that way that dogs do right before they bark at a ghost. And then she screamed. It was the kind of scream usually reserved for discovering infidelity or finding out your favorite gelato has been discontinued. Birds scattered. A wind chime 3 houses down stopped mid-jingle. "You murdered my lilies," she wailed. I was still in my slippers, holding a mug that said, "Gardeners do it in the dirt," and blinking like someone who had just accidentally stepped into a soap opera. "They were my lilies," I replied, trying to sound reasonable. "In my garden, which is on my land, that I own, with money, and a mortgage." Karen didn't blink. Her eyes were laser-focused on the empty dirt, like she was identifying a crime scene. "They were there when I moved in," she snapped. "So were you," I muttered. "Not helpful." "I nurtured them," she continued, ignoring both sarcasm and logic. "I watered them every time they drooped. I even named them." "You named the daylilies?" She crossed her arms. "Marigold, Sunny, Petal, and—" "You named a daylily Petal?" She stomped her foot. "They were mine. You destroyed them." Now, most people, when confronted with this level of suburban hysteria, would sigh, maybe apologize just to keep the peace. But I had already been accused of botanical homicide once that weekend, and I wasn't going to play along. I pointed to the metal property marker again, which by now had become the holy grail of this turf war. "Karen, that's my side of the fence. Those lilies were on my side. You don't get to claim my plants just because they were visible from your kitchen window." She squinted at the dirt, like she could somehow will the flowers back into existence. Then she said the words I should have expected but still couldn't believe. "I'm calling the police." And she did. She pulled out her phone, muttered something about property destruction, and made the call with the confidence of someone ordering a latte. I stood there in disbelief, wondering if I should start live streaming this for educational purposes. How Not to HOA, a documentary in real time. 15 minutes later, 2 officers arrived. To their credit, they maintained straight faces the entire time. I explained the situation, calmly, without using phrases like plant psychosis or floral delusions. Karen, meanwhile, pointed at my garden bed as though it had personally insulted her lineage. After inspecting the property lines, one officer nodded and said, "Ma'am, the lilies were indeed on your neighbor's land." Karen's jaw dropped. "But they weren't yours," the second officer added gently, as if breaking news to a child that unicorns aren't real. Karen stared at the garden, then at me, then back at the garden. "I demand justice," she hissed. The officers exchanged glances. One said, "Ma'am, you might want to go inside now." And just like that, Karen was dismissed by law enforcement like a disruptive guest at a wedding. She turned on her heel and stomped back to her house, slamming the door hard enough to rattle her wind chimes. I stood there for a moment, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or start planting faster before she came back with a court order. Eventually, I went back inside and Googled how to grow tomatoes under surveillance. Because if there was one thing I had learned that weekend, it was this. Nothing grows faster than a grudge in the suburbs. After the police left and Karen retreated into her house like a disgraced royal banished from the Garden Kingdom, I thought it was over. Silly me. I resumed my peaceful life of overwatering houseplants and pretending my basil was thriving when really, it was crying for help. The garden bed remained quiet, freshly tilled and full of promise. No lilies, no drama, just soil and potential, and maybe a little lingering judgment from the gnome who had witnessed everything. Karen, for a few glorious days, vanished. No yelling across the fence. No early morning sprinkler accusations. No surprise HOA reminders slipped under my door. Just silence. And when Karen goes quiet, that's when you worry. My friend Marlene, who once lived through a similar HOA war involving an inflatable Santa and a cease and desist letter, called me 2 days later. Her voice was urgent, like someone warning about an incoming tornado. "Sweetie, I love you, but if you haven't already installed a security camera, now's the time." "Really?" I asked. "Over a flower bed." "She thinks you murdered her plants in cold blood," Marlene said. "That woman is one Chardonnay away from burning down your tomato dreams." That sounded dramatic. But then again, Marlene owned 3 emergency wine openers and a taser shaped like a lipstick, So I took her advice seriously. My aunt, who has long believed the government is secretly run by HOA presidents, chimed in too. She offered to mail me her old Ring cameras. Karen sounds like the kind of woman who'd steal your tomatoes just to hold them hostage. I chuckled, but in that nervous way you do when something sounds too specific to be entirely fictional. Still, I dragged my feet. Between work, life, and my deeply unhealthy obsession with binge-watching crime documentaries, I never got around to installing the cameras. I figured the worst was over. Karen had made her scene, gotten schooled by two very patient officers, and stormed off into the annals of neighborhood legend. Except, there was one thing I hadn't accounted for. Karen's ability to hold a grudge longer than most houseplants live. The woman had been publicly corrected. On her lawn. By law enforcement. In broad daylight. And if you think someone like Karen would let that go, you probably also believe low-sodium chips taste the same. I started noticing little things. A faint scraping sound near the fence at night. A garden glove mysteriously moved from one end of the yard to the other. A weird pile of rocks that spelled what might have been traitor in cursive. Okay, maybe that last one was a stretch, but I was officially on edge. One morning, I found a printed flyer taped to my mailbox. Know your property lines. Don't be a garden thief. No name, no HOA logo, just passive-aggressive Helvetica. I stared at it for a full minute, wondering if this was a warning, a threat, or Karen's attempt at starting a print campaign. I should have installed the cameras right then. Instead, I poured another cup of coffee and told myself it was fine. People cool off. Neighborhood tensions fade. And surely no one would commit an actual crime over flowers, right? Right? By the end of the week, the tomato seeds were sprouting, the cucumbers had been planted, and my biggest concern was whether I had bought the wrong kind of mulch. I even started sleeping better, finally trusting that the madness had passed. But late Saturday night, as I stood by the kitchen window rinsing dishes, I saw a silhouette outside. It was blurry, swaying slightly, holding what looked like a piece of wood. A bottle? I blinked. Gone. Probably nothing, I thought. Maybe just a raccoon. Or a squirrel. Or a raccoon who had taken up woodwork. Totally normal. I didn't call the police. I didn't check the yard. I went to bed. And that's when I learned. Sometimes, the scariest thing isn't the storm. It's the silence before it. Because Karen wasn't done. Not even close. You'd think after a police visit, public embarrassment, and a flyer campaign worthy of HOA Watergate, Karen might decide to let it go. But no. Because as I learned the hard way, some people don't move on. They set things on fire. Literally. It started with the smell. Not the smell of smoke. Not yet. No, it was the smell of something wrong. Something faintly alcoholic and weirdly floral. Picture a Yankee Candle called Rage and Chardonnay. It was just past midnight, and I was up, as usual, making questionable snack choices and watching a documentary about people who fake their own deaths for insurance money. Educational, really. The house was quiet, the air was still, and my tomatoes were peacefully photosynthesizing under a grow light out back. And then, the sky flickered orange. Not sunset orange. Not cozy campfire orange. No, this was chaos orange. The kind that makes your heart skip a beat and your insurance deductible weep in the distance. I dropped my bowl of cereal and ran to the window. At first, I thought my yard was on fire, which would have been tragically poetic. But no, the flames were coming from across the street, in front of the house that belonged to my other neighbors, the Hendersons. Nice people. Quiet. Once gave me zucchini I didn't ask for. Now their side yard was engulfed in flames. And the source? A melted trash bin, a pile of smoldering planks, and, wait for it, a half-empty bottle of lighter fluid rolling down the driveway like a drunk villain's calling card. Cue me, barefoot and panicked, on the phone with 911, yelling things like flames, trash, possibly Chardonnay-fueled arson. The operator was impressively calm. Are you safe? She asked. I think so, I said, ducking behind a potted fern. Is anyone hurt? Not yet, but I might pass out from disbelief. She told me help was on the way. And that's when Karen appeared. Karen, in her bathrobe, holding a garden trowel, looking like Martha Stewart's evil twin after a wine-tasting gone feral. She was standing at the edge of the Hendersons' lawn, wobbling ever so slightly, blinking like someone trying to remember the lyrics to a national anthem they've never heard. I was trying to make a statement, she slurred. What kind of statement involves fire? I yelled back. She blinked. They took your side. Whose side? She gestured toward my yard. You. With the lilies. And the fence. You started it. Karen, I said, as gently as possible for someone whose blood sugar was crashing. This isn't a reality show. You just lit someone's recycling bin on fire. Cue sirens. Red, blue, and the sound of firefighters who've seen too much. By the time they arrived, Karen had sunk to the curb in a kind of smoldering, suburban shame spiral. Her robe had slipped off one shoulder. Her mascara looked like abstract art, and she mumbled something about justice for the perennials as they cuffed her. I stood there, wrapped in a hoodie, watching the flames get doused and wondering if it was too early to start writing a memoir. The Hendersons were safe. Miraculously, no one was hurt. The fire had only scorched their lawn and warped a bit of siding. Still, a house had nearly burned down. Over a flower dispute. Later that night, I gave a full statement to the police. They asked if Karen had a history of this kind of thing. Define this kind of thing, I said. Do you mean emotional terrorism by Tulip? They didn't laugh. But they did not. Karen was charged with arson, destruction of property, and possibly impersonating a rational adult. I'm not sure about the last one, but I like to believe it was implied. I went inside, shaken but somehow unsurprised. After all, Marlene had warned me. The camera I never installed, still sitting in its box on my kitchen counter. As I crawled back into bed, I whispered to myself, you should have planted peppers. Because nothing says summer like a garden war ending in fire. You'd think once someone has lit a neighbor's trash bin on fire while muttering about perennial revenge, the story would end. But no, because if there's one thing Karen taught us all that night, aside from the fact that bathrobes are not fireproof, it's that justice, like compost, takes time and smells a little weird at first. Let's rewind. After the sky lit up like a low-budget Michael Bay movie and Karen was found loitering near the Hendersons' flaming azaleas, the fire department swept in like a team of slightly annoyed action heroes. The flames were doused, the trash bin smoldered in defeat, and Karen sat on the curb, robe slipping, eyeliner running, muttering something about the great betrayal of the neighborhood council. I, still barefoot and vibrating with adrenaline, had just finished my second phone call with 911, during which I uttered the phrase, yes, I believe the suspect is intoxicated and also emotionally invested in lilies. By the time the officers approached her, Karen had entered what I now refer to as Stage 4 HOA delusion, confession as performance art. She looked up at the cops with the sincerity of a woman auditioning for a reality show called Desperate Lawn Wives and said, it was me. I did it. I set it on fire. But it was symbolic. One of the officers blinked slowly. Ma'am, symbolic of what? Karen paused, clearly trying to remember. Of injustice, she said finally. And stolen flowers. And that's when the handcuffs came out. The arrest itself was surprisingly gentle. Karen didn't resist, just sort of flopped into the back of the police cruiser like a sack of confused grievances. As they drove off, she pressed her forehead to the window like a poet in exile. The neighborhood, meanwhile, was shook. The Hendersons were kind, grateful, and slightly shell-shocked. Their kids, two high schoolers who had slept through the entire fire, woke up just in time to catch the aftermath and ask if this meant school was canceled. Everyone else, buzzing. Within hours, the cul-de-sac turned into a live-action Reddit thread. People stood on lawns, whispering in tones usually reserved for celebrity scandals and unconfirmed UFO sightings. Did she really confess? She said it was about the lilies? Was she drunk or possessed? I was stopped 3 times while walking my dog. Once by Mr. Taylor, who offered me a cookie and whispered, we always knew something was off about her irrigation schedule. By noon the next day, our HOA's emergency board convened under a pop-up tent near the mailboxes. Karen, naturally, was unavailable, being held for questioning and likely detox. The meeting was brief, somber, and full of baked goods. Trish, our newly appointed interim president, brought lemon bars and suggested we begin revising some of the more outdated HOA guidelines. Maybe, she said delicately, we remove the clause about communal flower maintenance. A round of nods. Someone clapped. Someone else cried. It was beautiful. Karen was officially removed from the board. Her lawn ornaments were confiscated for safety reasons, and a neighborhood-wide message went out asking everyone to take a deep breath and reconsider setting things on fire. A few weeks later, she returned home. Quiet. Unshaven hedges. No wind chimes. Her Lexus had been replaced with a rental sedan that looked embarrassed to be there. She kept to herself. No more flyers. No more accusations. Just the occasional curtain twitch. I didn't speak to her. Not out of spite, but out of something more powerful. A complete lack of energy to engage in garden-based warfare ever again. Life returned to normal. Or whatever normal means when you live in a neighborhood where someone once declared war over lilies and lost in a blaze of questionable judgment. I planted tomatoes. Real ones, this time. They grew beautifully. Sometimes, I stand in the garden at sunset, watering the vines, listening to the birds, and wondering how it all came to this. Then I remember, it started with a daylily, and ended with a woman in a bathrobe confessing to arson under the influence of boxed wine. God, I love suburbia.